Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, it would be fair to say that for Donald Trump, even when he was just presidential candidate back in 2016, there has been an obsession when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now that the JCPOA is still in place, even though the United States has walked away from it, and the other JCPOA signatories have told the U.S. it cannot use the snapback mechanism, at least according to their understanding of the deal, the U.S. seems understandably, to an extent, of course, angry and annoyed, but it still wants to get its way when it comes especially to the arms embargo, which is set to expire quite soon. So now there is talk of, within the next few days, possibly Donald Trump signing an executive order, which would mean that the U.S. would place secondary sanctions then on all parties that do enter into any sort of arms trade with Iran once that arms embargo expires at the United Nations. What does all of this mean? How important is it for the arms embargo to expire for Iran? How important is it for Iran to be able to get arms from other allies, be they the Russians or the Chinese at this point in time, considering, of course, in all these years, it's had to, in large part, rely, of course, on just domestic abilities to upkeep all of its weapons, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, and I'm joined by Yousef Azizi, who is joining us from Virginia in the U.S. today. He's a researcher at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs. He's currently working on his dissertation about U.S. foreign policy as well as Iran's nuclear program. Joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. is Reza Khanzadeh, who is a research fellow at Sharif University's think tank. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. He's worked with Iranian organizations on human rights, public policy, foreign relations, as well as international business. Reza and Yousef, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Reza, let me start with you. What would an executive order, such as the one that Donald Trump may place in the next couple of days, what kind of an impact would that have? I mean, it's not like it's a brand new thing. Secondary sanctions have been in place on anybody who does business with Iran anyways.
Correct, yeah. So I believe the impact that it would have at this juncture in Trump's presidency, and also where we stand with the UNGA coming up in a few days, and also with a few of the pushes by Washington to kind of show Iran as the aggressor. One in specific would be the attempted assassination of a U.S. ambassador in South Africa. These are all tactics by the Trump administration and symbolic pushes by the Trump administration to essentially corner Iran, if you will, into showing it as the aggressor, as the country that needs to be put in its place, so to speak. The impact it will have, in my opinion, will be quite minimal because of the election coming up. But also, this is not anything new for Iran. They've been under sanctions, as you said, and also secondary sanctions for decades. They have been resilient. They have found ways to bypass or circumvent these sanctions. But also you have Russia and China who are saying that they are still going to sell arms to Tehran. And for Russia, the fear of secondary sanctions is also very minimal because they're also under sanctions. Yeah. Going back to their relationship with Ukraine. So I feel like it is not going to be that much impactful. It's more symbolic.
Yousef, in your opinion, how important is it for Iran? I mean, is this just a symbolic fight at this point on the part of the Iranians to have the arms embargo lifted?
So yeah, I agree with our guest that, preventing the sellers of weapons to Iran from accessing to the U.S. market, it's the meaning of the secondary sanctions. So in the case of China and Russia's military industry, it is nonsense because they are independent from United States market, or they are already some part of them under sanction by the United States because of the dispute in the eastern part of Europe or Southeast Asia. So I think it is symbolic in kind of, we can say that in theory, the China and Russia can sell, advanced weapon to Iran. But the problem here is about the intention or the practical issues. If China and Russia wanna go through that and sell some advanced technological arms or military equipment to Iran. So this is another question. This is another part. But it is interesting that, the United States has failed during the past 2 months 2 times in United Nations Security Councils in 2 most important issues about Iran and Iran dossiers. One is about these extending UN arms embargo against Iran, and also about initiating the snapback against Iran. So failing in the most important part of international organization, United Nations Security Council, against Iran. I think some of these actions by President Trump is just selling or talking to his proponent in the United States in upcoming election, that I did whatever I promised 4 years ago to you about Iran, but we know that it's failed.
Reza, this is a test for the international community, isn't it, at this point? Because this arms embargo is set to, or the U.S., wants to trigger the snapback mechanism, which would, in theory at least, come into place tonight itself, Saturday night, 0000 GMT on Sunday, technically, actually. And obviously in the international community, the other parties to the JCPOA have said, no, you don't have the right to do that because you're technically not now a party to the JCPOA as well. Do you think that the international community, for all of its rhetoric, because we've had the Europeans also say we're standing by the JCPOA, will they really be able to?
I do believe so, because once again, going back, to what I said earlier about the U.S. elections coming up, this is essentially a waiting game. And back in August, we saw that Germany's foreign minister, in a conversation with his counterpart, I believe in Israel, stated that the Europeans' arm embargo would be in place to expire in 2023. So they do have other mechanisms and other deals with Iran that they can kind of use as a crutch, perhaps, for these next couple weeks and months, up until they see who the next U.S. president will be. But also seeing what the Trump administration has been doing for almost the past 4 years, and following really the global community, we've seen the U.S. With a handful of Middle Eastern countries and Israel on one side and the entire world on the other side. So this type of isolation that we see Washington that has found itself in, which I think is a very unique position, given the history of the U.S. and Iran. I do believe the Europeans do have some ground footing to stand on and, show their support for Tehran and seeing what will happen. Because, Joe Biden has said if he does become president, he will re-enter the JCPOA and he will renegotiate on better terms. So, given the fact that the U.S. election is only a few weeks away, yes, I do believe that Europe will be able to withstand this.
Okay, so let me be advocate for a moment, Yusuf, because, many experts are saying, yes, that even the Iranians possibly behind the scenes are hoping in some way that it's probably Biden who's going to win at the end of this year. But do you think that, realistically speaking, that after so much has already happened ever since the U.S. walked away from the deal, that it's really that simple for Biden to say to the Iranians, okay, we're going to come back to the deal, and that the Iranians would accept that? I mean, I really wonder if it's going to be that simple for any new administration.
No, it is not simple. The Joe Biden administration probably will be faced a huge amount of pressure, but by U.S. domestic agenda. I mean that the lobbyists or even the Democratic, some of the hawkish member in Democratic Party and in Senate, in Congress, United States Congress, even the Democratic member of the Congress. So the problem with Biden is that one of the major problems with Biden administration, if they win the election, is that the Iranian next election, presidential election, comes about 5 months after the new president, steps to the White House. So they are not going to easily go back to JCPOA or the deal in 2015 without knowing who will become the next president in Iran. So it is very important because, part of the JCPOA in 2015 when it's signed is about, empowering some faction in Iran, mostly the, moderate or so-called reformists. So it is very important for Joe Biden and his team and the United States as a whole, the foreign policy decision-making in the United States, that who is empowering in Iran and who can claim this victory in Iran as, we force the United States to go back to JCPOA. But on the other hand, Joe Biden says that, when we return to JCPOA, when Iran's completely back to its, guidance by JCPOA. And it is nonsense. It is nonsense because it is more than 3 years that Iranian people and Iranian government, they are heavily under restriction, economic restriction. So the Iranian always says that, okay, United States should pay this price and then come back to the JCPOA. But, it is a struggle between the Iranian domestic politics, United States domestic politics. So it is very complicated issues.
Indeed. I'll give you the final word. I'm sure you know of this theory within international relations and politics, Reza, about how it's easier sometimes to actually have two strong men on both sides of a negotiating table to hammer out a deal versus two moderates, if I may use that term, two liberals, or however we want to term such sides. Do you think that we are at some point coming to that with the Iranians and the Americans, where we may very well have a quote-unquote more conservative upcoming government in Iran, and possibly, I mean, at this time, it's really hard to say if Donald Trump will win or not at the end of this year, but there are a lot of people saying that he may very well win. Would that possibly, in fact, be a good thing to have two very tough men or administrations on both sides hammer out a deal?
Unfortunately, in theory, yes. There always is a possibility. Going back to the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the U.S. But given the history between Washington and Tehran, and given that Trump's White House they performed the assassination on Qasem Soleimani, and the hardliners, if you will, or the more conservative branches of Iran's government, pointing to what Trump has done and saying, see, we told you all along, you can't trust Washington, you can't trust this administration or any future, U.S. president. I doubt that, a deal will come about if Trump is reelected, and with Iran's, own presidential election coming up in a few months, as our guest, said. And also, you have to see that U.S. now, and I went back to the State Department's website, and I think back in August, they have over 8,000 sanctions all across the world. And when you look at Iran, just Iran, they have also hundreds, if not thousands, of sanctions on Iran. And that type of relationship where it's maximum pressure, I can't see a scenario really where Tehran would be willing to deal with a Trump administration during his second term. It's just too difficult to see.
All right, you're there at that, but we appreciate both Reza and Yusuf for their time this morning, speaking to us from Virginia and Washington, D.C., respectively, speaking about their opinions on this upcoming executive order. I mean, it seems that this is a done deal at some level. Tonight itself, as I said, 0000 GMT on Sunday. The U.S. had wanted to trigger that snapback mechanism of the UN sanctions upon Iran. The other JCPOA signatories have said, stop, you can't do that. You're not technically now a party to the deal. Will the executive then order come right at that point at 0000 GMT? We don't know. I mean, obviously, we'll wait to see what happens at the White House. With Donald Trump, you never know already what to expect. He may very well hold off a couple of days as well, as negotiations may happen behind the scenes. But how important is all this for the Iranians? How important is for them to have access to new arms, to more technologically advanced arms, especially in a region which is fairly dangerous and has its own security challenges for the Iranians, as well as, of course, other parties in the region also. There's a lot on the table. There's a complicated relationship, certainly, between the Iranians and Americans that has always been in place, and we'll have to wait and see how this then affects that going forward also. I'll be back with the next segment after this break.